Some things start small: a light that flickers, a socket that heats up, a number out of place. In my case, it was a spreadsheet, a cold, emotionless report, but with data that knows me better than family members. That spreadsheet doesn't lie. Because the farm is under federal monitoring, every light bulb, every irrigation pump, every piece of equipment turned on inside is recorded with a zeal that borders on obsession. That's the price of participating in an energy efficiency incentive program. I get tax benefits, but in return, I give absolute transparency. And then, out of nowhere, a spike in consumption appears. At first, I thought it was a mistake, something technical, perhaps a misreading of the sensor. But when I looked at the curve on the graph, I felt my stomach turn. Everything was normal until the 17th. After that, it was as if someone had turned on an industrial freezer, a heating system, and some soccer stadium lights at the same time. Consumption jumped so disproportionately that it looked like they were using the grid to power a submarine. The farm was empty. Nobody lived there. Only the caretaker came once a week to check the basics. Nothing to justify it. That's when I decided to visit, alone, with the folder of reports in one hand, the key in the other, and the flea behind my ear already barking. I arrived in the late afternoon, and the first thing I smelled was burnt grass. Not the kind burned by fire, but by artificial heat. That feeling of hot air coming up from the ground. The shed seemed different. There was no noise, but there was a tension in the air. And then I noticed a wire, underground, barely covered, coming out from behind the fence that separated my property from the side of the condominium. A wire with poorly made insulating tape and a clear direction. The house of the woman in the beige blazer. Her, the same one who called herself the moral janitor of the HOA, the one who thought the world revolved around the color code of the sidewalk, the one who even tried to regulate the type of plant everyone could put on their balcony. Only now, she's decided to be a power distributor too, using the pole on my farm as a clandestine source. I followed the wire, literally, crouching down, like someone following the trail of a crime. It passed under a broken fence, curved behind a row of eucalyptus trees, and went straight into her garden, through an open hole behind the warehouse, all hidden, nothing visible from afar. It was a well-done cat, the kind that only cynical people or people who are very used to stealing would do. Only she made a mistake. She did it with a farm that talks to Brasilia before turning on the porch light. I returned home and sat down in front of my computer. I took a deep breath. I analyzed the graphs. I cross-checked the data. I was sure she was drawing energy from me, and not by accident, by choice. And then the idea came to me. I thought, what hurts this kind of person the most? What dismantles someone who lives on appearance, on control, on false status? The answer came in seconds. A bill, not a scandal, not a lawsuit, a simple piece of paper. Because she was the kind of woman who treated slips of paper as personal offenses. So I opened Canva, used the HOA logo, the same one she loved to print on flyers about plants suitable for outdoors, and created a document with the title HOA Invoice, Community Energy Bypassed with Environmental Fee Included. That's it, $10. Not for the amount, but for the symbol, for the debauchery, the controlled affront, the surgical irony of showing that I knew about the crime, but preferred to play her game, that of the letterhead, the stamp, and the aggressive collection. I delivered it in a brown envelope, no sender, just with the inscription, Urgent Delivery, HOA Administration. I left it in her mailbox early the next morning, with my balcony camera ready, just to watch, just to savor it. When she opened the envelope, her hand shook. The paper fell to the floor. She looked around, picked it up again, reread it. She rushed inside, but the damage had already been done, because she knew that I knew. After she received the bill, the neighborhood was never the same again. The woman who walked with the posture of someone who founded the condominium now walked like someone looking for a hole in the ground to disappear into. Her heels no longer made a sound, her clipboard disappeared, and the pamphlets about harmonious gardening stopped appearing in mailboxes. It seemed as if her ego's power had been switched off at the main circuit breaker. That morning, she left in a hurry. Normally, she walked like someone parading for the Council of the Gods of Suburban Morality. But that day, she went straight to her car, without looking around or saying good morning. She carried a thin briefcase under her arm, pressed against her body, as if she were holding a secret that was too hot to handle. I thought she was going to look for me, that you'd make up some excuse, try to pretend you didn't understand. But nothing. She disappeared all day. Night came and her house was still dark. Literally, only the dim light in the kitchen was on, as if even the light bulbs were ashamed to shine in there. But then the signs came, small but clear. 2 days after the bill was delivered, an electrician showed up at her property. A small company uniform, a truck with a ladder, and the look of someone who had seen it all. He stayed at the back of the house for hours, tinkering behind the warehouse, close to where the wire disappeared from view. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw the gestures. The man pointed to the ground, scratched his head, talked and talked, while she crossed her arms with the kind of expression that only those who have been caught with their hand in the cookie jar know. In the afternoon, the truck drove away, but it left a small black box on the door, the kind that stores cut wires or evidence. She stared at the box for a few minutes before taking it inside. Her body bent, her haste contained, her face hard. She seemed to be carrying not only the wires, but the weight of the embarrassment. In the HOA group, she disappeared. Absolute silence. No post about good use of solar energy. No photo of the community reading corner she had invented on a bench in the square. Members began to discreetly ask about her. A nosy neighbor asked, "Is she all right?" She disappeared after the invoice story. Another replied, "Invoice? Of course. That opened the door. That's what I needed." In the dead of night, a new letter was posted on the bulletin board in the HOA meeting room. No signature, no sender, just a generic notice with the title, "Misuse of Outside Resources. Conduct contrary to the Community Moral Code." And at the end, a highlighted sentence, "Stolen energy illuminates only shame." Someone took a photo. They posted it in the group. The subject exploded. The rumors started. They said she was being sued, that the IRS had shown up at the farm, that the inspectors were cross-checking data. An exaggeration, of course, but it was enough to turn her tension into panic. 3 days later, she called an emergency meeting with the closest residents. She tried to keep control of the narrative. She said that everything was nothing more than a technical misunderstanding, that there had been an error in the installation of the external collection system. A nice name she invented to avoid saying that she had dug a clandestine power tunnel from someone else's shed. The most ironic thing, she tried to make it look like she was the victim. She claimed that the bill was an attempt at intimidation by a resident who was unhappy with the HOA's rules. She just forgot to agree on this version with the electrician who, a few days earlier, had cut the cables and told the neighbor that he had never seen anything so well hidden in a residential area. The story took on a life of its own. Each neighbor told a different version. Some said she bathed in the farm's water too. Others swore that she was selling energy to the back of the block. All lies, of course. But when credibility goes down the drain, even the truth can't help. And in the middle of all this, she had the nerve to try to approach me at the bakery. She appeared from behind the counter, with that plastic smile of someone who tries to act as if nothing had happened. She let loose. "Look, about that invoice, maybe there was a mix-up. I wasn't directly involved in any of the installations. It was all the work of the old service provider. Suddenly they connected it wrong." I just looked at her and replied, "So you won't mind if I show the revenue people the consumption report from the farm, will you? After all, if it was a mistake, it's not your fault, right?" She froze, literally. Her eyes went dry, her mouth half open as if she'd forgotten how to continue the lie. And then, for the first time, she had no answer. She left the bakery with the bread forgotten on the counter. A few days later, the HOA announced that it would review all cases of unauthorized interference with private property. A new committee would be created to oversee outside installations and use of resources. But everyone knew who motivated this change. She was now just the name that nobody said out loud, but everyone knew. The woman who tried to feed off the energy of others and received the symbolic cost of shame in return. But the real bill was yet to come. Because the next report from the tax office brought a surprise that even I hadn't expected. The third IRS report arrived on a rainy morning. There was a strange weight in that envelope. It wasn't the paper. It was the energy it carried. No pun intended. The document, as always, was technical, straightforward, cold as a laboratory. But at the top of the third page, in bold, something new appeared. Persistent anomaly, possibly external deviation identified in Sector B. Sector B again. The same area as the shed. The same stretch where, a few weeks earlier, the woman dug a gambiara disguised as an alternative environmental catchment. Only now, the report came with something more serious. A red seal with the text, "Forwarded for technical irregularity analysis. Integrated Federal Unit." That was no joke. The IRS had cross-referenced the energy consumption data with the incentive program's rural network, and what had previously been just my suspicion was now stamped on a piece of federal paper. I called the program's technical consultant. He answered with the calm of someone who has dealt with a lot of people trying to be clever. "It's already being dealt with, sir. The deviation has been identified, and as your property is registered in an incentive monitoring program, there is no need for a formal complaint. The network itself starts the investigation process." I asked what that meant. He replied, "It means that if the origin is confirmed as external, the Revenue Office automatically triggers the Municipal Prosecutor's Office. You don't have to do anything for now." I hung up the phone with a feeling that was hard to explain. Part of me wanted justice, another part wanted to watch, and a third just wanted to know if that woman understood what she had gotten herself into. She thought she was drawing power from a disused shed, without knowing that the place was plugged into a federal system that was more sensitive than a lie detector on a reality TV show. She thought it was just a rural way, a hidden wire, a community detour, a little unauthorized help. But now the system was responding. Over the next few days, 2 unmarked vehicles appeared in the morning, parked on the opposite side of the road, facing the farm's side entrance. Men in dress shirts, briefcases in hand, spent half an hour analyzing the post, the fence structure, and the shed. One of them was using a tablet, the other, a portable GPS. They didn't come in. They didn't knock on my door. They just recorded it. In the afternoon, one of them walked calmly to her house. He rang the doorbell. It was answered. I didn't hear the conversation, but I saw her posture. Arms crossed, mouth tense, that forced little smile of someone who knows she's in trouble but is trying to look collaborative. They talked for less than 5 minutes. Then he handed her an envelope and left. The next morning, she was at the gate, fiddling with wires, removing the remains of what had once been the neighborhood's most daring gourmet cat. She had an electrician with her, but this time it was someone else. More serious, more technical, no uniform, no truck, a real professional. While he worked, she walked in circles in the garden, like someone trying to look busy so as not to be questioned. But all eyes were on her, all of them. Neighbors drove by more slowly. Some stopped across the street pretending to look at their cell phones. Others simply watched from the window in silence. There was no need for conversation. Everyone knew. One neighbor even commented to me, "It's funny, isn't it? The woman who used to say that not even clothesline wire could cross the fence was there pulling cable from other people's property." I smiled, because it was true. The irony was suffocating. For years, she had treated every inch of the neighborhood as if it were an extension of her own yard. Now they were discovering that her garden was fed by the energy of a land that wasn't hers. And worse, that land was talking to Brasilia in real time. On Friday, the IRS sent a new notification. A letter was filed informing them that the analysis of the irregularity had been completed and that the evidence pointed to an unauthorized detour of energy. The document didn't have her name on it, of course, but it clearly stated connection identified with property bordering on private jurisdiction outside the scope of authorization. That was enough. The HOA called a new meeting, and the topic was clear: misuse of private infrastructure by community member. She was asked to explain herself. On the night of the meeting, she showed up with a white envelope and a speech ready. She tried to play the victim. She said that she was misled by an inexperienced technician, that she didn't know that the farm's network was connected to the federal system, and that she never intended to cause harm. But nobody bought it. The new president of the HOA, a retired engineer with more patience than I would have, responded calmly. The problem here isn't the technician, it's the audacity. You dug, you called, you used, you knew it wasn't yours, and you only stopped when you received a symbolic bill. The silence that followed was more powerful than any argument. The vote was unanimous. She lost all rights to representation within the HOA. She could no longer vote, propose, supervise, or even use the community structure independently. What's more, the association decided to officially cooperate with any investigation into the case. She left the room without looking at anyone. Her house spent days with the lights off, not for lack of energy, but because sometimes shame is too dark to turn on any lamps. But the best was yet to come. Because the Retita's final report came with an unexpected observation, one that opened the door to a turnaround that neither she nor anyone else could have imagined. The Retita's final report arrived exactly 32 days after the first peak in consumption. This time, with an official protocol, a stamp from the technical department, and an extra insert that doesn't usually accompany this type of document. The paper was different, thicker. The language was more direct. The final remark was short but lethal. Forwarded for investigation of civil and criminal liability on behalf of the user linked to the property of unauthorized origin. In other words, the bomb was primed. The woman received the same notice, but in a different format. A bailiff knocked on her door on a sunny Monday. The scene was discreet, almost poetic. While she tried to appear calm by watering a pot that was barely alive, the man in the simple vest delivered the paperwork that officially made her subject to investigation for qualified theft of energy, invasion of rural jurisdiction, and misappropriation of federal benefits. Yes, because by drawing energy from my farm, which is part of a federal incentive program, she automatically benefited from a public subsidy, without paying, without authorization. This turned the clever neighbor's gambit into a crime with the possibility of a heavy fine, civil restraint, and, if she insisted on the theater of innocence, even jail time. The most curious thing was the impact on the neighborhood. Some residents who had previously fawned over her began to back down, in public and in private. Those who liked to follow her floral guidelines were now pruning their plants in the middle of the night, as if to get rid of a spell. Silence became the general rule. No one wanted to be associated with her. It was as if, from one moment to the next, her surname had become synonymous with clueless, with a lawsuit on her back. But she tried to resist. She had to see. In the following days, a letter written on recycled paper began to circulate, distributed in selected mailboxes. In it, she said that she was being silently persecuted by neighbors who don't understand the community function of energy, that she had been technically deceived, and that the light that came on in her house was not theft, but an attempt to integrate homes into a sustainable and symbiotic cycle. It was almost an apology poem dressed up as a justification. It was even funny. The problem: she signed the letter with the title, Former Moral President of the HOA. That's right, a signature she invented herself, perhaps in the hope of appearing official, or to try to regain control of a narrative that was already buried, along with her threads. One of the residents took a photo and posted it in the group with the caption, "Her light may have come from the farm, but the journey is all private." The tax office didn't reply to the letter, but the prosecutor's office did. 3 weeks later, the case appeared discreetly in the municipality's police report. Small, but present. Line 78. Investigation opened into theft of electricity on rural property under high federal surveillance, with signs of clandestine underground connection and continuous load detour. Her name was abbreviated, but everyone knew it. She was called to testify. She left the house through the back door. When she returned, she was a different woman. Her formal clothes gave way to a sweatshirt, her hair was tied up anyway, and for the first time since she moved to the neighborhood, she passed a neighbor without saying hello. She just walked past, as if trying to evaporate. The HOA at this point was already treating her as a closed issue. The committee set up to oversee external installations approved a new rule. Every alternative electrical connection must be declared and registered under penalty of a fine and condominium sanction. The rule didn't have a name, but the nickname caught on quickly: Karen Clause. Meanwhile, the Treasury stood firm. The Revenue Department closed the case with the note that there was no relevant tax loss because the system quickly identified and cut off the deviation. No penalty fell on me, which, let's face it, only made it all the more unbearable for her, because it wasn't enough to have been caught. She was caught, exposed, and still had to watch everyone go on living as if nothing had happened. Except her. The last I heard of her was a letter delivered to the president of the HOA, a brown envelope with a sender in another city. The letter said, in short, that she had opted for a fresh start, away from the toxic energy of the current environment. Look at the term. And that she wanted more empathy in the future for women ahead of their time. 2 days later, the house was up for sale. A discreet sign, cautious brokers. The property remained on the market for months until it was sold below value. When the new owner arrived, he found a box of cut wires in the back and a folder with old pamphlets on good energy practices in sustainable condominiums. She threw it all away. Her clipboard? Nobody ever saw it again. Today, when I look at the farm shed, I see the same place where it all began. The same ground where she thought she could string a thread and pull out what wasn't hers. But that wire brought more than an electric current. It brought out who she was, and it showed the neighborhood that sometimes the worst light someone can turn on is the one that exposes what's behind the facade. And if you like this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.